Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Wildfire Wednesdays Fire Aware, Fire Prepared webinar series. Welcome specifically to this one, Prescribed Fire in Oregon. My name is Dan Stark, and I am your host and FNR Extension Agent serving Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln counties, and I'm joining you all from Seaside. This webinar is last in a webinar series in 2021, meant to help all who live in Oregon learn from the 2021 fire season. Today, you'll hear more about prescribed fire in Oregon. Overall, this webinar series aims to address preparedness at three levels: individual, community, and the landscape. Because you signed up for this webinar, you'll receive information in a follow-up email, and feel free to visit the online webinar guide for updates. We'll send you a link for that at the end of our webinar today. Some logistics before we begin the presentations. I'd like to quickly cover some of these logistics for you. This session is being recorded, and all webinar recordings can be found on FNR YouTube channel. We are also streaming live on the Extension's Facebook page. Hey, everybody out there in Facebook land, welcome. There's the closed caption feature, so hopefully you are all seeing that at the bottom of your screens. If you do not want to see the captioning, simply go to live transcript and hide the subtitles. For the people tuning into the webinar on Zoom, your audio has been muted. If you are having audio troubles and are connected to your computer's audio, I suggest hanging up and dialing in with your phone. You can always post a question in the chat window if you are having technical difficulties. If you have a question on the information that is being presented today, please type your question in the Q&A window below, not the chat box, the Q&A window. We have limited time, but we'll do our best to answer your questions live today. If you don't catch all the information presented, don't worry. We'll provide all of the resources and links mentioned during this webinar on our fire program website. And we'll even follow up with an email, like I said, just to be sure you get that information. I do want to acknowledge that all OSU Extension education happens on indigenous homelands. We are working with OSU, our tribal liaisons, and tribal members to better understand and build meaningful relationships with tribal communities. Okay, let's get going. I want to first introduce my colleagues on the webinar team. Our co-host for today is Fire Program Manager Carrie Berger. EJ Davis is moderating, and we have Regional Fire Specialist Aaron Groth and Ariel Cowan in our Fire Regional Specialist team who will be answering your questions. We're going to get started with the poll first. We would like to share with you. This poll will appear on your screen in a second. This is an anonymous poll. So please type your questions in. You will have about 30 seconds to participate. So please answer your question. So what are your concerns about prescribed fire? You may have a few of them there. Choose the one that you're most concerned about. So we have risk of escape, there's smoke, potential impacts on wildfire, and there are costs. So those concerns of prescribed fire. So are you that risk of escape, that they might be escaped, that's your number one concern, or those smoke, the smoke that's generated from those types of practices, and those potential impacts perhaps on wildlife species, or maybe some costs. And we'll just let this go for a couple more seconds. We're all done there. Okay, so let's end the poll and have a look here. Okay, so it looks like we have risk of escape there at 49% as the top one from you all, and then smoke a close second at 44% from all of you. Potential, the cost then came in third at 34%, and then we have potential impacts on wildlife. I may have said potential impacts on wildfire earlier, and I apologize for that. It's potential impacts on wildlife. So thank you all for participating in the poll, and we could stop sharing that now. Okay. Fantastic. And just let me get back to my notes. Okay, so from here, I'm ready to hand it over to our first speaker. Today, I'm happy to introduce to you, she's no stranger here on this, on the Fire Aware, Fire Prepared webinar, and of course in our communities. Amanda Rao is a regional fire specialist, and she's going to talk to you and give you an overview of prescribed fire. So thank you, Amanda, and please take it away.
Dan, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I'm going to just go ahead and launch right into my presentation. So just give me a moment to find it so I can share it with you. Hey.
We're seeing the note side of that.
Swapping it. Haha, I'm on it. Thanks, Dan. You're taking good care of me, so I really appreciate that. Thanks everyone again for joining us today. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, so I'll probably have a hard time containing my enthusiasm. Burning's basically what I got in the business of wildland fire for, so I'm going to launch right in. Well, let's just start off with what a prescribed burn is. In the simplest form of a definition, it's fire that's intentionally applied to vegetation. But then you might ask yourself, well, what's the difference between that and arson? Well, usually in a situation with arson, it's intentionally applied to things, maybe vegetation, maybe other things, for not very good intentions and not really planned out in the sense of we're going to burn this area for this reason to generate these benefits. And so what we would add to this is things like a predetermined area for a specific set of reasons. And that's really important because wildfires start with what we call a point source ignition, and they grow from that point. And I think it's important to understand that prescribed burns more or less operate in the opposite. And so we're going to walk you through that here and really explain what the difference is between a prescribed burn and a wildfire, how that looks different, and how this intentional application of fire to vegetation generates some really positive effects and benefits to people and nature. Trying not to use too many slides with long lists on them here, because I know you're not all here to read screens necessarily, but there's so many reasons to burn that there's no other way than to just list them and kind of go through that here. The one that's most well known is hazardous fuels reduction, and that's to reduce fire hazard. Pretty straightforward. You take away fuel, which is one of the three parts of the fire triangle, and you will basically reduce fire. Habitat for wildlife, that was actually of least concern in the poll. And I was really glad to see that because fire is generally pretty good for wildlife habitat. There are cases where, and I'm speaking of prescribed fire, so wildfire can have pretty devastating impacts on wildlife habitat. It can also have really beneficial impacts on wildlife habitat. But with prescribed fire, it's almost always going to have a positive benefit. Cultural purposes, which you're going to hear more about today, are really important and at the heart of where prescribed fire really came from and why it exists as a relationship between people and land through fire. Restoring and maintaining ecological function, that includes hydrologic function. A lot of folks don't realize that water is very much related to fire in that vegetation uses water. And so if you remove vegetation that uses water, it can free it up to be used for other purposes. Site preparation for planting, whether that's trees or reseeding a native prairie. Management of invasive species. There are species of non-native plants that can be maintained or destroyed by fire. So sometimes they like fire, sometimes they don't, but regardless, when it's timed well and used with a suite of vegetation management tools can be a really effective way to manage invasive species, which is related to pest and disease control. There are many pests and diseases on the landscapes today that would not be there to the degree that they are with an active fire regime in place. So the lack of fire does lead to a lot of those problems. Management of grazing and forage, both for livestock, cattle, sheep, other grazing animals, as well as wildlife. This might actually should have probably been higher up on the list here, but silviculture, forest health and restoration very much benefit from the application of prescribed fire. And then related is rangeland health and restoration. Very different relationships between rangeland and forests and fire, different frequencies and intensities, but relationships nonetheless, and ones that we can really control more using prescribed fire than we can with a lot of other tools. Enhancement of plant production in in crop production, as well as natural ecological systems. And then, just in that more general sense of controlling desirable and, or controlling undesirable and enhancing desirable vegetation. So then I get really down to the question of why not burn? I think we should ask ourselves that as much as we should ask ourselves why. Because really putting fire on the land is something that is very much in need and in a deficit. So maybe we'll flip that question more in the future. So moving on to what do we do to start this process of deciding when we're going to burn and under what conditions? Well, we have to develop what we call a prescription. And that prescription is based on pre-identified environmental conditions that are either established through observation, practice, or through modeling programs that tell us that if we drop the match on this day under these conditions, this is what we can expect to see. So the written plan documents those pre-identified environmental conditions that create what we call this prescription. That plan also contains the objectives, such as reduce fine fuels by 80 to 90%, for example. Say that's your primary objective because you want to get rid of a thatch layer so that plants can have access to sunlight and photosynthesize again. You want to talk about fuels. What kind of fuels are there? What are the conditions of the fuels? And we'll talk more about what those are. What kind of equipment you're going to need? What safety precautions are you taking? How are you going to manage smoke? And what do you need to do in preparation for burning in advance before the day of? So these are just things that a prescribed fire plan will want to include, and what the prescription is. You may have heard that term, and it's just those pre-identified environmental conditions under which you can burn. This is kind of an old graphic that I've been using in my presentations for a while because I haven't found anything better. And it really gives you all of the different types of fire behavior and what fuel conditions or characteristics affect those. So compactness has to do with how fluffy the fuel is, how much air can get into the fuel as it's arranged to enhance combustion, how much of it is there loading, just the volume. Horizontal continuity, meaning if fire is moving across the landscape, is the continuity of the fuel sufficient to carry the fire, or is it going to stop because it runs out of fuel? Vertical arrangement really relates more to how easily will the fire get into the crown or the canopy? How many ladder fuels are there? Chemical content relates to things like oil and wax content that can cause things to burn even when they're very wet. This is more common in the southeastern United States, where it's very humid, but the plants are really just built to burn from a chemical standpoint. Also true in Southern California, a lot of chemical content in the chaparral brush community. The size and shape of fuel really impacts fire intensity and spread and whether it spots. And then moisture content, which is really a fascinating field unto itself in terms of how different sizes of fuels gain and lose moisture relative to their environmental conditions. So moving into fire behavior and weather, the primary conditions that we are looking at when we're establishing that prescription and then monitoring the conditions before, during, and after ignitions and burning are the air temperature, relative humidity, wind, days since rain, and atmospheric stability. And these all ultimately relate back to fuels as well as smoke. Specifically atmospheric stability in that while unstable atmospheres tend to produce more volatile fire behavior, they're also the best conditions for dispersing smoke and getting them away from communities. Days since rain is specifically important when you're looking at burning in the fall, because that's the time when you're usually waiting for rain to decide to start burning. And so you need to start looking at that in terms of how much things are drying out. And that all goes back to and relates to fuel moisture. Now, this is probably the most technical thing I have here, but I had to throw it in because I just think it's so interesting when you start looking at how wind and slope start interacting and then what that does. Oh, sorry, I need to go backwards here. Got too excited there about this slide. I got even more excited. So really just looking at how wildfires and prescribed fires are more or less controllable based on whether they're under the primary influence of wind or slope or both. So when you have no wind, you have more controllable conditions. But what you find is that heat is rising. So if you're trying to keep fire out of the canopy of your trees that you're burning underneath, perhaps that's not the best thing. So you add a little bit of wind, and then that actually starts to push the heat down and really kind of help move fire so you can work with the wind. But then you start adding wind and slope together, and that's when things really start moving and you have more potential for movement. So when you're planning a burn, you start looking at these things. Is it going to be on flat ground? Is it going to be on steep ground? And then what kind of wind am I going to tolerate and be able to manage for and control fire under when burning? So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the different kinds of fire spread, which is important because it relates to the types of ignition techniques that are used when conducting a prescribed burn. This picture shows all three types of fire spread. On the bottom, you see backing fire. So what's happening at the base here is that this fire is slowly moving against the slope, down the slope, or the wind, or both. And it's moving slowly and it's completely combusting. What happens in a head fire is that the fire is moving quickly, but it's not necessarily fully combusting. So where you see all this black smoke up here, that's from incomplete combustion from head fire, whereas the lighter smoke that you see where it's backing along the base is actually complete combustion. That's really consuming more of the fuel. So just to be really simple, backing fire moves against the wind and against the slope. Head fire moves with the wind and with the slope. And then flanking fire is more or less perpendicular. It's kind of the in-between, where as you see these lips of fire kind of moving along the slope there, side sloping. They're not just moving up, they're not just moving down. And each of these types of fire have different types of benefits in terms of consuming fuels and generating the effects that you want. Flanking fire gives you a little bit of both, a little bit of head fire, a little bit of backing fire. But from a graphical standpoint here, I can kind of show what that looks like. So you have your point source ignition. And by the way, prescribed burns can be ignited using point source ignitions, but this is what is used for modeling wildfires. So you have a single ignition point, and what happens from there? Well, you get all three types of fire spread. You get backing fire, you get head fire, and then you get flanking fire on either side. And these 6 types of ignition patterns produce different types of fire spread depending on how they're employed. So flanking fire is only going to produce flanking fire, which is basically just lighting, walking straight into the wind or down the slope. It's going to produce that fire unless the wind changes or there's a slope change. Strip firing can produce whichever of these effects you want, but you don't really call it. Flanking fire is basically a strip into the wind. So strips are really just either with the wind where a head fire forms or against the wind where a backing fire forms. And really they do a little bit of both when you're running strips in a pattern called strip head firing. But it's important to note that it's all dependent on what the weather does. And so if the weather starts to move around, it will change these the effects of these types of ignitions. Dot ignitions are basically just point source ignitions. They do the same thing that dropping a match would do. Ring firing can be used to get something to burn. So you put a ring around it to make it burn. Say you want to get rid of a particular tree, but you can also use it to get things to burn away from something. So if you want to protect a house, you can ring around it to burn away from it. Chevron patterns are basically walking down ridge lines, and then concentric firing involves starting in the middle and making a big spiral. It's actually quite beautiful and very rare. I've only seen it in video. So I won't spend too much time on this here, but I just want to note that when we are burning, or when we're planning our burns and when we're burning, we're thinking about the aspect and the wind and how it's aligned. And so we know that one aspect, say a southerly aspect or an easterly aspect, is going to be receiving sunlight during more of the day and an earlier part of the day. And so we might plan our burn there during that time, whereas burns that would be on a north-facing slope that aren't going to get sun till later, we might not be able to even get them to do anything. So these are really important subtle nuances that come into play when we're planning our burn. And part of how we set ourselves up for success is by considering these things in advance when we're writing our plans. Some of the pre-burn notifications or preparations include notifications, installation of fire breaks, obtaining burn permits, as well as smoke management permits. In Oregon, that really depends on where you're at. If you're in Lane County, you have to work with Lane Regional Air Protection Agency in order to ensure that you're within compliance for smoke management. If you're within ODF protection, you need to get a permit from them, the Oregon Department of Forestry. You may need to work with your local fire authority, reducing snag hazards in advance, making sure that you have water, that the sources have been verified, and that you have water delivery established, ensuring that personnel and resources are available. But I really want to go back to notifications and communicating and making sure you tell people what you're doing, because a lot of people see smoke and they just think that must be a problem. Whereas if you tell everybody what you're doing in advance, then when they see the smoke, they don't necessarily react right away with fear or concern or calling 911. And we also want to make sure that we do our part to avoid overwhelming 911 call centers with calls that are unnecessary if we can let people know what we're doing in advance. Just wanted to make that plug for ensuring that you do your due diligence in communications and notifications. Equipment and holding, you know, I think a lot of people when they get involved in burning think about how much fun it is to light things on fire, which it is. But the important job in my mind is to ensure that we get to keep doing this. And we get to keep doing this by keeping our burns where they're supposed to be. And when burns leave their units, it doesn't necessarily mean it becomes a wildfire, but it certainly has a higher likelihood. And so in order to keep getting to do this important good work, being really diligent about holding, making sure your equipment is working well, it's operational, everything's ready to go for burn day. You're not scrambling or wondering whether or not you've got everything you need, doing all that in advance. And that gets back to that pre-burn preparation. But here's a lot of our tools that we use to make fire happen on the ground. The drip torch is perhaps the most commonly used device overall, although I think people are probably experimenting more with other techniques, as burning on the shoulder seasons can necessitate use of propane torches and some other devices. But we have fusees, which are basically similar to a flare that's used to light fuels like grass. You really can't use that to get heavier fuels to go. Drip torches contain 1 gallon of what we call slash mix, which is anywhere from 3 to 5 parts diesel to 1 part gasoline. And that is to ensure that you get longevity in your burning, as well as a good ignition initially when you start lighting. And berry pistols are sort of like a flare gun used to ignite interiors of units that are not readily accessible by personnel. It's also really important to make sure to plan for medical emergencies, safety and contingency, having a medical plan in place that helps you to know in advance where to go if something goes wrong. Because negotiating all of that in the midst of both a live fire activity, such as a prescribed burn, and needing to figure all of those details out can be really overwhelming. And so, you know, the golden hour and making sure that we capitalize on the moment of being able to get someone treatment when they need it is really important. Contingency has to do with what are you going to do if the fire does escape and turn into a wildfire? Who are you going to call to come help? So you basically have plan A, plan B, plan C, all of that lined up in advance to make sure that you know what's going to happen if something goes wrong. And then safety just being really overarching, most important thing that encompasses all of this. And so having a component of your plan that addresses safety issues and talks about what you're going to do to mitigate them and how you're going to plan for a rare event or emergency. Smoke management is one that we have the unique opportunity in prescribed fire to actually manage smoke, to plan for it, to burn under conditions under which we do not predict that it's going to negatively impact communities. So that really should be addressed in your plan. In some cases, you're going to need, smoke management clearance. Most of the time, you're going to need clearance of some kind from someone to put smoke in the air, and that's going to help you avoid making the mistakes of burning under the wrong conditions. But really getting good about understanding dynamics of ventilation, atmospheric stability, and how that influences smoke dispersion will really help you maximize windows and opportunities to get good fire on the ground. I would be remiss if I didn't include this quick anatomy of a prescribed burn to just give you a picture of what this looks like on the ground, carrying fire across the landscape, utilizing some existing roads for holding, creating some of them through line construction, creating a black line into which you send fire, such as this black line. And then we'll see if it works. I've been told not to play video, but I'm doing it. And I think it's going to be good. So here's a burn at the Willow Creek Preserve. This is here in the Eugene Springfield area. And this is kind of a nice way to see the different kinds of fire behavior. In this case, we're burning into the wind. So we've created a black line, a catcher's mitt there that's already black. And then this person is actually creating head fire that they're sending back into this catcher's mitt. And you can see kind of how that works, how we're basically doing the opposite of a wildfire. We're walking fire back into the wind, as opposed to setting a fire and letting it burn with the wind. And then another thing to note here is that they're doing what is called a strip head firing pattern, but people are coming from either side and meeting in the middle and then going back. And part of why they're doing that is to kind of keep the heat built up and going, because you can really use fire itself to control fire. And so that's part of what's happening there. And then to just wrap up, I want to show you before, immediately after, and then post burn at an oak woodland, similar location, not far from that video. Here it is, full of poison oak, pretty choked up. And I could only send a couple of my goats in there to burn this. And then this is what it looked like thereafter, easy walking. And then this is what it looked like the following spring, a place I would be happy to hang out. And so hopefully that will inspire some of you out there to get interested in prescribed fire and learn more. And with that, I'm going to introduce the next speakers. I'm going to introduce all three, and then they're just going to go back to back. We have David G. Lewis. He's an assistant professor of anthropology and ethnic studies at Oregon State University. We have Catherine Dunn, who's the Oregon Coast Preserve Steward for the Nature Conservancy. And we have Dana Skelly, the Regional Fuels Program Manager for the U.S. Forest Service.
So I guess I'm going to proceed. Let me share my screen. If I can figure out how this thing works. Okay, here we go. You guys all see that?
We see it. It's your notes screen. If you just need to expand it to full presentation.
I'm doing that. Okay.
Yep,
right.
That looks great.
All right. So thanks for inviting me, everybody. Chris and Amanda and others that I may or may not know on here. I'm not sure. Yeah, first off, I want to start out with a little bit of context. So Native peoples generally, not all Native peoples know that their peoples set fire in the past, and this is a thing that's we've been having to relearn and reteach each other, and so it isn't true. So some tribes are really far ahead of the game, like the Karuk tribe and maybe Grand Ronde. Other tribes are not so caught up yet, don't have a fire program going. And but most tribes did participate in some sort of fire management of their land in the past. And so there are various reasons why they did or didn't. But the reason why most tribes don't know exactly perhaps what their history was, even the cultural part of setting fires, is because for much of the last 150, 200 years, the United States has tried to sort of take away our culture, just destroy our knowledge of our culture. And so that is all coming back. We're actually doing lots of research now, and we're trying to understand how in our cultural way that we set fires, why we set fires, things like that. And so we're coming around to a pretty good understanding of that. And I think that Amanda and I talked about this extensively in various locations, but it's it's kind of enlightening, to use a pun right there, and it's kind of fun to learn that there's parts of our culture that we did that that benefited us and really benefited the world around us and help make it the place it is today. And so let's go into some of my slides here. First off, our tribes were participants in what we call a seasonal round. It's kind of an anthropological concept that means that we sort of went around the landscape and did different things during the right season to collect foods, to collect basket materials, to collect tools on the landscape. And this was mainly a spring, summer, fall seasonal round in our area because our winters were so dramatic, so cold. Not necessarily the same in places like California where the climate's slightly different, sometimes quite a bit different. But our main cycles of moving around here in Oregon were spring, summer, and fall. And so we had seasonal training periods. We have winter periods were times of sort of staying in our plank houses and maybe doing craft-like activities, telling stories, making basketry, tools, weapons, things like that. And our area probably was between around 60 miles seasonal round area around our tribes for things like trading and things like that. So, and this is my picture of our little camas plants, two different colors in the same field. So the white camas there is not death camas. It's actually a white variety of camas. Some of the clues as to how we operated come from calendars that were collected by anthropologists back in the 19th century. This is the Tualatin calendar collected by Albert Gatchett in 1877. It's hard to read, but it has 12 months that have Kalapuya names. And the whole calendar is really based around the Wapato and camas cycles. And so you can see that they were, really kind of following these cycles pretty closely. They knew exactly when things were going to be ready. They knew when they had to be cooked. And they basically seemed to be really kind of on a farmer's almanac in the way they lived. And some of those plants are coming up here right away. And I did a graphic here for what a Kalapuya season round may look like. We have things like hunting camps and spring salmon camps where salmon would come over the falls into the valley here. Camas root camp, weeding materials camp, huckleberry camp, trade gathering, acorn camps, a weeding materials camp again, and then fall Chinook, and then a fall prairie fire. And this is one of those aspects of our culture that we had stories about, but not a ton of information about. And it's been sort of being recovered just in the last 20 years, really. And then we have hazelnut camp and hunting camp and trade gatherings in Winter Village. And so we see this sort of seasonal round really encompassing our world. We lived with the seasons, moved around in, some people would call, settlers would call this wandering. And we're not wandering if we do these same things every year in the same pattern. It's not a wandering. It's actually just moving around to where the food's available, to where the resources are available, to gather these things, and then moving on after you've gathered enough to another camp to do something else, maybe even back to your winter village where you're storing these things up for the winter time. And so and this is a pattern that probably went on for between 8 and 11,000 years in our area here. So it becomes less wandering and more permanent, more civilization-like, if you will. And some of the various aspects, like in the summer, we have camas gathering. There's a couple of varieties of camas and what they look like as a bulb when you just gathered them. We wait until after. There's a couple different camas seasons. One is before the camas actually erupt into flowers. You can dig them then. You can also dig them in the middle of the summertime after the bulbs have gone to the energy of the bulb has come back to the bulb when the seed period is over, when the seeds have turned into sort of like little bells. They actually get really dried out and they're really kind of cool to walk through a camas field and hear these little bells go off. But after that, in that period, that's the time when you want to get out there and also dig them as well. And really camas, because they don't move around quite a bit and the field are pretty well known, you could dig them really any time of the year and have food. So that makes camas extremely important for just the keeping the people fed, providing a constant food source all times of the year. And then if you want to store them and cook them up and have readily available food, you can do that as well. And people would do that in the middle of the summer, collect them by the thousands, cook them up in large underground pits with hot stones, and then store those cooked camas for later eating. And so that was a pretty constant pattern.
Excuse me, David, I just want to interject. We're at time here, so if you could possibly wrap up here soon. We've got to get to the other speakers. This is so enjoyable. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. I thought I had 6 minutes. I didn't realize it had been 6 minutes. Sorry. So the other camps would be, acorn gathering, collecting berries in the berry baskets. There's a Wapato. And all these plants are on here because this is what benefits from fire. I mean, burning the land would actually benefits most of these plants, makes them grow better, eliminates a lot of the pests and a lot of the competitors, and helps what we call the world renew itself for the next season. And so, hazel is a big one. So hazel, we collect the nuts, but the hazel sticks themselves were used for basketry, and they had to be burned or cut in order for them to grow back really super straight and turned into baskets later on. So that's a big plant for that. And so in around late September, when the first rains come, the fire would come. They would burn the fields, usually set by women. And because this was done annually, there would not be a massive burn. It wouldn't be a catastrophic burn. It would be actually a cool burn that would just run across the tops and burn off this season's dead branches and tissues and undergrowth. And so it would not be a catastrophic burn. There was no recorded accounts from any settlers in the valley that where they got burned out of the valley because the Indians are burning the valley. The burns were not so bad that they destroyed the settlers encampments. So all those things go into the things that we're learning about the tribes, the things that we're learning about our tribes, and the reasons why the fire was important to us. It has been important to us for thousands of years. And that'll be it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was fantastic. And we're going to move on now to Catherine. So I'm going to bring up your presentation. And so just give me a second to do that. And just a reminder, we'll be taking questions at the end here. So be sure to type those questions into the Q&A box. We're seeing some people are doing that already. Let me make sure I get the screen up and ready. And you should be seeing your main slide there, Catherine. Is that correct?
Yes, that's
okay.
it. Thank you, Dan, for managing my PowerPoint for me. And thank you, David. That was a wonderful presentation. It's really interesting, and I'd love to hear you elaborate more someday. Okay, well, I am Catherine Dunn, and I'm the Oregon Coast Preserve Steward for the Nature Conservancy. I help manage this special coastal headland called the Cascade Head Preserve, located on the Central Coast, just north of Lincoln City. And I play a large role in our program to conduct ecological burning on the preserve. There are stories that fire was used by indigenous people at the site to manage the open landscape. And so the local plants and animals evolved and adapted to this frequent disturbance. Dan, could you advance the slide, please? Oh. Next slide, please, Dan. Oh, thank you. So ranchers later used the grassland to raise sheep and cattle. And when the Nature Conservancy purchased the property in 1966, grazing was stopped to allow native wildlife to come back to the site and restore natural processes. However, over time, it became apparent that without periodic disturbances of fire or grazing, the grassland can become overgrown with trees and shrubs, eliminating habitat for a diversity of wildlife and rare plants that make the coastal prairie their home. And we call this encroachment. Next slide, please.
The slide advancer is just taking its time on my
Okay.
end. I am so sorry. I'm hitting it and it's
That's-
just taking its time because that's what happens in Zoom here. So I'm gonna,
That's
there we
fine.
go. Okay. Sorry.
So in this, I mean, I'll just tell you, talk about it before it comes up next time. But this one was critical. In this photo, you can see the forest creeping up slope and encroaching on the meadow, which is what I was describing earlier, encroachment. And so once the spruce trees get large enough, they shade out the grass. They drop needles and that creates a duff layer and that builds up soil. And that supports the growth of other forest understory species. And with all the rain on the Oregon coast and the abundant light on these open slopes, these trees grow really fast. And this conversion to forest happens surprisingly rapidly. And so due to this natural succession to forest, as well as development for human use, coastal prairies have become rare. And so one overarching goal for the Cascade Head Preserve is to maintain it as open grassland. And controlled burning is one of several tools we use to maintain or restore that habitat. Next slide, please. And so the Nature Conservancy and our partners have been conducting ecological burning on the preserve for over 30 years, starting with small research plots to see what it would do to the vegetation on square meter plots and scaling up to larger management burns like seen in this photo. And this one is from 2001. Could you put the next slide up, please? And in addition to maintenance of the open habitat, we use controlled burns to achieve some other ecological management goals, such as protection and recovery of rare species. On the left is the Cascade Head catchfly, a very rare plant, 99% of which lives on the preserve. And our research shows that it responds positively to fire. And so that careful use of fire is important for maintaining that rare population. And on the right is the Oregon silver spot butterfly, a federally threatened species. And the different stages of the butterfly rely on prairie plants that benefit from fire. Fire will clean up the buildup of dead vegetation, also known as thatch, and it recycles nutrients to stimulate growth of grasses and flowers. And other research conducted on the preserve demonstrated that the plants that sustain the butterfly respond positively to controlled fire when there's an adequate seed bank. And what we noticed through some of our research was that there was not an adequate seed bank for some of the species that were critical to the butterfly, especially in its caterpillar stage. And so we did what's called adaptive management and used this information to change our management approach. And in 2013, we paused controlled burning to focus on planting and rebuilding that seed bank. The next slide, please. But in late September of 2018, we conducted our first prescribed burn on the site in 15 years. We focused on 30 acres of the preserve experiencing heavy shrub encroachment, and that's shown here. For those of you familiar with the site, the trail switchbacks through this section. Next slide, please. And it was a large coordinated effort requiring many trained firefighters, 2 miles of hose and closing down the trail. Amanda Rao presented earlier on how much prep work and understanding of fire behavior is involved in conducting a burn safely and effectively. And she was actually our fire manager at the Nature Conservancy at the time and helped pull all this together. She is exceptionally skilled at watching the weather forecast to pick a day with ideal conditions. And so as you see here, the smoke lifted and blew away from the closest town. And the burn worked well, achieved our goals of reducing shrub cover and killing many encroaching trees. After the burn, we spread native seeds collected from the site. And the next spring, many forbs germinated. The elk really enjoyed the fresh grass that came up after our controlled burn. And so we plan to burn as conditions allow more regularly moving forward. We've been preparing for our next treatment. We'll continue to treat areas with heavy encroachment, but also focus on areas to benefit the Cascade Head catchfly, that plant, and the Oregon silver spot butterfly. Next slide, please. And so I thank you for listening. I'll be taking questions later in the Q&A, and you can also reach out for opportunities to volunteer with us. We need people to help us collect seed to spread out after the burn. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. All right, Dana, we're all ready for you.
Okay, let me get that up. Okay, you should be seeing the presentation in notes mode. And let me see if this works to get it in real awesome PowerPoint mode. You got it?
You need to switch screens. We're seeing your notes screen there too. There you go. Yeah.
Yep, hang on one sec. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, all right, well, I'm gonna go through this. Oh, are we good?
We are good. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, thanks so much for having me here. My name is Dana Skelly. I manage the Hazardous Fuels Program for the Forest Service for the Pacific Northwest. And I know we all know where we are, but I always like to just show off all of our forests in Oregon and Washington. This is what I'm representing here today. And again, I'm going to fly high on a few things so we make sure we have time for questions. But just to show you like the portfolio of the work that we do in the region, in this chart, it shows our regional accomplishment for hazardous fuels treatment work, which includes mechanical thinning, commercial harvest, non-commercial harvest, as well as prescribed burning. And prescribed burning runs a whole gamut of activities from landscape burning, which is mostly what we're talking about today, but also pile burning and activity fuel burning. And you know, of course, that is generally different in different parts of the Northwest. The majority of our landscape burning occurs east of the Cascades, and then the majority of the activity fuels work occurs west of the Cascades. Not a hard and fast rule by any means, of course. The other piece of this data is wildfires. When wildfires meet our desired objectives for the landscape that are identified in forest plans, those acres count as treated as well, and that's the little green pieces, or sometimes large green pieces that you see here. But the big picture to notice is that for the most part, from our work, the majority of the work that we do is mechanical, and prescribed fire plays a varying role from year to year. Sometimes almost half of what we get done is through prescribed fire. A lot of that is because, you know, limited on burn windows, some of which Amanda and other folks highlighted today, but we're always trying to increase the pace and scale, because the fact is, prescribed fire is the most effective fuels treatment on the landscape when it comes to mitigating against catastrophic or unwanted effects from wildfires. And it is the most cost effective, especially the larger they get. Cost per acre for our treatments across the region can range from $150 an acre for basic mechanical thinning projects, all the way up to over $1,000 an acre for mechanical projects in the wildland urban interface, where you're closer to homes. It tends to get more expensive. Prescribed fires, however, typically cost anywhere from $35 an acre, maybe to $200 on more of our small scale burns, where you're in a high interface area and you need a lot of support to make sure that they stay where you want them to stay. So, so you can see where increasing the pace and scale of burning is definitely more efficient and cost effective. And then it is more efficient because it is more effective when the wildfires happen. Here's a quick screen capture from our updated assessment of our fuels treatments after the 2021 fire season. In the federal government, anytime we spend taxpayer dollars to do vegetation management work, to help mitigate against wildfires, hazardous fuels reduction work, we're required in policy to go see if those treatments were effective or not so that we can adaptively manage and change our strategies in the future based on what we see happening on a given fire year. This year, we had crews out and assessing those treatments as early as September. We had over 1,459 treatments intersect with wildfires that our crews assessed pretty much in September. A lot of those were on the Bootleg Fire. And when you look at the slide, you can tell if you, paying attention, I'm sure everybody was to the fires this summer. So the South Central Oregon, that's the Bootleg Fire. There's a whole chain of fires across the crest of the Cascades on the Willamette and the Umpqua. And then up in Washington, there were a number of fires on the Okanagan Wenatchee. There was a fire up on the Umatilla, a couple fires up on the Umatilla that are highlighted here. And then there was a fire on the Malheur that shows up on this map. This isn't all of the treatments that intersected with fires, but these are all the ones from the big fires. Typically, the forests are usually spread pretty thin that time of year. And we always support them from the regional office to make sure we get the data to answer those important questions and to improve our treatments in the future. This is data from our 2018 assessments, and it's just a great way to show you, well, how seriously we take this and what we're looking at when we see it. When you look at this, wildfires, which are very similar to prescribed burns in a lot of cases in terms of how effective they are in the landscape for mitigating a future fire, are the most effective treatment for changing fire behavior as a result of the treatment. You can see broadcast burns are the second most effective type of treatment. You can see pile burning is actually the second most, and broadcast burns are third. And then thinning and chipping mastication are farther behind. So when you look at that, part of the reason is because oftentimes those treatments aren't the final treatment for a piece of the landscape. Usually we're expecting to finish up after any kind of mechanical work with landscape burning, because again, we know that that's the most effective on a landscape. Here's another thing that we look at when we're thinking about were the treatments effective or not. Did it contribute to the control or management of the fire? A lot of times that depends entirely on where the treatment's placed and if it's in a strategic location that the fire management teams and crews can work from when the fires happen. You can see again here that overwhelmingly anything with fire as part of the treatment is more effective than anything that's solely mechanical. So I'm sharing this with you all to just applaud your interest in helping get more fire on the landscape and validate your interest in terms of how effective these treatments can be. But I don't think anything will validate that interest more than a picture from the Bootleg Fire that many of you may have seen. This is from a project area on the Fremont Wainema, drone video footage taken by the Klamath tribes. And you can see incredibly clearly here the difference in the effectiveness of the treatments from the air. So at the very bottom third of the screen, it was thinning only. It was planned for prescribed fire, but they did not get to the prescribed fire before the Bootleg Fire impacted the area. You can see at the very top half of the screen that those areas had no treatment at all. And obviously there's the largest patches of what we would consider high severity, where there's a blackened, well, there's hardly any green, right, to see up in that part of the image. And then in the center, thinning plus prescribed fire. So pictures are worth 1,000 words. And this one is an amazing illustration of why what you're interested in learning about more and putting on the ground in the landscapes you influence is so important. This is a link to the 2018 dashboard of our treatment effectiveness assessments. We're finalizing the 2021 data now, and we'll have something up in January, and we'll have a link available through the 2018 dashboard so you can all find it. And I went through a lot of material really quickly, but again, with the idea of having maximum time for question and answer. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and kick it back to you.
Thank you so much, Dana. That was great. A picture does tell 1,000 words. Okay, before we start our question and answer period, we're coming to a close here. I just want to give our calls to action for today. For those of you who have been on our webinar before, or you might be new now, we give calls to actions for you to explore more about these topics and ways that you can become active. So by all means, sign up for county and regional alerts to stay abreast of prescribed fire activities and respect rules prohibiting visitors during prescribed burns. One thing that you can do if you own property, or you just want to walk out in your neighborhood or in your community, try to identify the types of plants and trees that surround you. With this information, you can find out more of the historic fire return interval in your area. You could use the Pacific Northwest fire regime tables provided by the USD Fire Effects Information System, and we have that link for you in your resources packet. Become a volunteer or a naturalist with the Nature Conservancy. You can also become a master naturalist or a land steward with Oregon State Fire Forestry and Natural Resources Extension. Okay, EJ, let's take it away with questions and answers.
Hey everyone, I'm your moderator, EJ Davis, and we just have time for a couple quick questions. First, and any of the panelists are welcome to answer this. We've had some comments about the importance of field burning for farmers in Oregon, the effects that might have on reducing fire risk. Can anyone speak a little bit about the importance of field burning for multiple objectives?
I'll give it a shot because a lot of the work that I've done in the Willamette Valley has involved burning areas that are adjacent to fields. They're considered these controlled ecological burns, whereas agricultural burning has been curtailed for a number of years as a result of an accident that occurred on I-5. And so I think that if we were to sort of re-engage that again, there would need to be efforts put into how the agricultural community was going to plan to avoid those kinds of impacts in the future, because that's kind of the reason why we're at where we're at now. I mean, that was a trigger. There was also air quality impacts that occurred throughout the Willamette Valley as a result of the amount of field burning that was being done. So now we have a lot more plowing that happens as a result. That isn't necessarily the best alternative. So I would get back to addressing the smoke management issues within the agricultural community, because that's really the source of the curtailing of ag burning.
Thank you so much, Amanda. We have another question. Can you clarify how annual understory prescribed burning would work with hazel? I think it grows too slowly to benefit from the annual burn. Maybe every 3 or 4 years would give material for fiber, but probably not acorns. Again, anyone would like to speak about that? David?
Yeah, hazel grows back really fast. The native hazel grows back really fast. Basket makers talk about burning 1 year, the next year the plant shoots out really fast and will and the hazel sticks that come out of that are super long and super straight, and so that is apparently the behavior of a native hazel. I'm not sure about the European hazel.
Okay, we just have time for one more question. Thanks for responding to that one, David. And then we're going to need to wrap up. So someone was asking about Catherine's presentation. Are there similar seed collection efforts with TNC happening in Central Oregon? Catherine, if you were able to speak to that.
Hi, Carrie. Thanks for your question. As for volunteer efforts, going to a preserve to collect native seed like this, I'm not aware of any right now, though there is talk of something at Sycan Marsh. I'm not sure when that would happen, but you can check our website, nature.org, to see volunteer opportunities. And there, a lot of the work that happens in Central Oregon is that requires seed is at a really large scale, and so in restoring sagebrush habitat, and so that is they've collected seed a while ago and they grow it out in large quantities at farms and use that to restore large landscapes. So that's what I know about Central Oregon seed collection efforts. It's big.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thanks for all of the good questions, and thanks to our panelists for all the awesome responses. I'll turn it back over to Dan to wrap up.
Great. Thank you so much, EJ. And yeah, thank you for all those great questions. Just a reminder, we'll be following up with a follow-up email, and we'll do our best to answer some questions as we can there too. Thank you all so much for tuning into this webinar and other webinars in the Fire Aware, Fire Prepared series as well. As a reminder, resources can be found online, and we will also follow up in an email. I've told you several times now. Please take care and remember to be fire aware and fire prepared. Thank you and have a great afternoon.